On an ordinary day outside of Denver, a rideshare driver was picking up a fare when he saw something unusual in the road ahead. He slammed on his brakes and swerved into the other lane to avoid hitting it. But what he saw next made his blood run cold. It was a creature unlike any he'd ever seen before. It looked like a bear, but it was on all fours and had a face that was more human than animal. And then it did something that was straight out of a horror movie. It turned its head 180 degrees and stared directly at him. Our driver had a dash cam rolling the entire time, and what he captured on camera has freaked people out all over the world. Some say it's a hoax, but others think it could be the first sighting of a real-life werewolf. What we do know is that this comes from a legitimate cryptid hotspot. The driver was traveling along a well-known stretch of road where Bigfoot sightings are common. There have been hundreds of reports of strange animals in the woods there, including a 2018 incident where a woman was almost hit by a large, shape-shifting creature. In the past, locals told police it was probably just a bear, but this was no ordinary bear. If it was a hoax, why did it run away? Like most cryptozoological hotspots, the area has been dubbed the Beast of Burden Triangle. The footage shows our driver on a normal day doing what he does best, driving Uber. Traffic is light as he cruises along in his sedan. Suddenly, he slams on the brakes and swerves to avoid hitting something in the road. At first, it looks like a large animal, maybe a deer or an elk, but then it scuttles off into the tree line and our driver stops to get a better look. What he sees makes him jump out of his car and run back to his phone. As he's getting closer, we can see that it's not a wild animal at all. It's a person. Well, a person-sized creature with dark fur all over its body. It's on all fours and seems to have human hands, although they are very deformed. To make matters even stranger, it turns around and looks directly at the camera. This is where things get weird. Its head turns completely around and it stares directly at the camera. Some say this is a fake. Perhaps a man in a suit. But if that were the case, how would someone breathe inside such a realistic wolf costume? It looks hot, and it would be hard to see with all that fur in your face. This is especially strange because the driver got quite close to it. If it were a person in a costume, wouldn't they have run away? The fact that it didn't move or try to hide makes us wonder if this was some kind of real-life werewolf. Werewolves aren't normally depicted as hairy, but perhaps this is what a werewolf would look like if it actually existed. They usually transform during the full moon, which could explain the glowing eyes. Of course, it could also be a person in a costume who was trying to scare people. Perhaps it was some kind of prank gone wrong. Whatever it was, it certainly looked real. After seeing it for himself, the driver couldn't believe what he'd seen. It wasn't until he checked his dash cam that he realized just how lucky he'd been. If it had attacked him, he might not have been able to defend himself. Dash cams are fairly common these days, but most drivers don't think about using them to capture evidence of a possible werewolf attack. Some have speculated that this is actually a member of a secret werewolf pack living deep in the woods. Werewolves aren't just a myth. There are actually packs of them living in the woods, and occasionally one will wander into town. That's what we've always wanted to believe. This may be the closest thing to a real-life werewolf that we'll ever see. Now it's time to make a decision. Do you think this is real or fake? Let us know in the comments below. And remember to subscribe if you haven't already. Welcome back, everyone. For the first time in about 6 years, we're going to tell a scary story this close to Halloween. I'll try not to make it too graphic. I don't want my mom to hear it. Anyway, here's one from our community member, The Phantom. I was driving a truck for a living in southern Utah. In the off-season, I used to do seasonal work at a ski resort in the winter, moving snow and people around. It was a pretty good gig. At the end of the season, they let all the seasonal employees go, and then they shut down the resort until the next season started. So that meant I had to drive across the mountain pass by myself after all my friends had left. On this particular day, I was driving through a small town near the ski resort. I stopped at a gas station to top off before hitting the long stretch of highway that would take me home. As I walked into the gas station, there was a guy inside paying for a soda. He didn't say a word to me and he didn't acknowledge me as I walked past him. I thought nothing of it and went to pump my gas. I finished pumping my gas and walked back into the store to grab a couple bottles of water and some snacks. When I walked out, I saw the same guy getting into the passenger side of my truck. He motioned for me to start the truck, so I did. Then he told me to drive to a certain place, but he didn't say anything else. And I could tell that he was a hitchhiker because he had a backpack and a big blue jacket on, and it was in the middle of July. I asked him where he wanted to go, and he just kept quiet. After a minute or so of him giving me directions and me sitting there quietly, I finally asked him if he wanted me to drop him off at a motel or something. Again, he just sat there without saying a word, so I decided to keep driving. About 10 minutes into the drive, I glanced at him and he was gone. I slammed on the brakes and turned around. I looked everywhere, but I couldn't see him. To this day, I still don't know what the hell happened to him. The thing that really freaked me out was that when I hit the brakes, his backpack was still in the truck. When I got home, I told my wife everything that had happened. She said that maybe I should have just kept driving until I saw where he got out or something. But then again, it was the middle of July, and I didn't think he would have been able to walk very far. Well, either way, I couldn't stop thinking about the hitchhiker and what had happened to him. So I decided to go back and look for him. I drove back to the place where I last saw him and started walking in the direction that he would have been walking. I must have walked for an hour with no luck. I was beginning to think that I'd never find anything. Then, out of nowhere, I saw a memorial cross on the side of the road. I walked over to it, and it said, "Unknown John Doe, mile 313. Looking back, I realized that I had passed several other crosses, but I didn't see them because I was so focused on finding the hitchhiker. I feel like I should have just kept walking, but there was a part of me that wanted to know what had happened to him, so I started driving back the way I came. I soon came upon the crosses again, and I started looking for something that might explain what had happened. There were several pull-offs along this stretch of highway, and most of them had picnic tables and grills. One of them even had a fire pit. I stopped at one of the pull-offs and decided to wait for a while and see if anyone would come looking for him or if I'd see any cars that might have seen him. After about 20 minutes, I saw a car driving toward me. I walked out into the road and flagged them down. They stopped, and I asked them if they'd seen a man walking along the highway. They said no, but they mentioned that there had been a report of a missing hiker in this area a few weeks earlier. They said that the authorities were looking for him, but they hadn't found anything yet. So I thanked them and waved them on their way. Well, that was pretty much the end of it. I never did find out what happened to that hitchhiker, but every once in a while when I'm driving down the highway, I think about him and wonder if I'll ever get that scared again. Thanks for listening, and be sure to check back soon for more terrifying tales from our community members. See you next time. Welcome to my channel. Today we will be reading from the r/no That's Impossible subreddit. So let's jump into the first story. The Road That Wasn't There. I was driving home from New Mexico about 4 years ago. I stopped at a gas station in Texas for some snacks and to top off. The GPS in my rental car told me to take a certain exit off of Interstate 25. I took the exit, and sure enough, there was the entrance to the highway I needed to merge onto. But when I looked up, there wasn't anything familiar around me. I thought maybe it was a new road or something because I knew this area fairly well. I decided to trust the GPS and merged onto what turned out to be a perfectly smooth and new road. It was very odd because this area is mostly farmland and desert scrubland, and I figured if there was a new highway, there would have been news stories about it. I mentioned it to the guy behind the counter when I went to pay for my Mountain Dew and bag of Flame and hot Cheetos. He looked at me like I was crazy. I asked him if they had a newspaper or something where I could look up if there was a new road or something like that. He just shook his head and said, "Nope, you must be dreaming." So I got back on the road and continued on my way. After about 5 minutes of driving, I realized that the road wasn't on my GPS, but it still showed the road I was driving on. And the weirdest thing was that it showed the road continuing all the way until it reached Interstate 10, about 20 miles away. Also, I noticed that the road was faintly glowing blue, which freaked me out, so I pulled over. I turned off my car and got out to see if I could see where the road ended. All I saw was cornfield. To say I was freaked out is an understatement. I called the police and they said that there was no record of any new roads being built in that area and that there shouldn't have been any roads there at all. I was in the middle of a cornfield, for God's sake. A cop eventually found me and asked me what happened. When I explained it to him, he too was confused. But since there was nothing I could do, he let me go and basically told me to find another route to I-10. I got back in my car and started driving. This time I followed a familiar road that I knew led to a small town about 10 miles away. When I got to the town, I stopped at the first gas station I saw to check my GPS. To my surprise, the road I had just driven on showed up on the map, but it didn't connect to the highway like it had before. It was just a road that ended in the middle of nowhere. To this day, I don't know how I ended up on that road. Maybe it was a hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and Mountain Dew. The next day, I emailed the rental car company to ask if they had put a new GPS system in the car because I couldn't help but think that it was somehow messed up. They responded that they hadn't changed anything and that I should try a different car. I never did, and I'm still not sure if that road actually exists. And that's all for the video today. So thank you all so much for watching. If you like this one, feel free to check out more content, and I'll see you all next time. Bye. A Georgia cab driver is out a few $1,000s after picking up what turned out to be a very special passenger, or should I say, a very unspecial passenger. Yeah, 'cause this chick wasn't even a real person. The incident happened back in April in Atlanta. The cabbie was driving near the Edgewood Avenue Club when he picked up this woman in the red dress. She told the driver to take her to the Hyatt Hotel on the avenue. The driver said that normally the fare for that ride is about $11, but because it was so early in the morning, the price was going to be higher due to the surge pricing. You know how Uber works. This is basically the same thing. But before he could even get to the hotel, the woman got out of the car, thanked the driver for the ride, and walked away. Now, the driver thought that was kind of strange, but he wasn't too worried about it. He figured maybe she just forgot her wallet or something. So he goes to check the seat where she was sitting, and he feels something squishy. You know, like if you were to sit on a seat cushion. And that's when he noticed that there was no legs under the dress. He runs to his dash cam to check the footage, and sure enough, the woman who had gotten into his car didn't have any legs. The video shows the driver pulling up to the curb. You can see the woman in the red dress getting out of the car. She kind of walks funny, like she's a little drunk. And then she just disappears around the corner. Police say the woman may have used a wheelchair at some point, but they don't know for sure. And by all accounts, the driver didn't do anything wrong. He just picked up a fare and drove her to her destination. It was only after she got out of the car that he realized that something was wrong. The driver said that he felt like he was being gaslit, like he was starting to think that maybe he was the one who was crazy. But when he checked the video, that's when everything came back to him. He knew that she wasn't a real person. Honestly, that's probably the least creepy part of this story. Think about how many times throughout your life you've gotten into a stranger's car, whether it's an Uber or a Lyft or a cab. And how many times have you sat in the back seat? I'm guessing for most people, the answer to that question is probably more than a few times. And now think about all the close calls that we've all had with human traffickers and kidnappers. There are plenty of horror stories out there of people getting into a stranger's vehicle and then being taken somewhere against their will. So yeah, in this particular case, I can understand why the driver would feel the way that he did. But what's the lesson here? I mean, I guess don't pick up fares that aren't human beings. But realistically, how often is a human trafficking situation actually going to come up? I mean, I'd say probably not very often. And I know that this driver is probably being extra cautious now, but eventually he's going to get over this and move on. What I feel bad for the guy is that he lost several $1,000s worth of fares while he was off camera, because apparently after he parked his car and went inside to show the manager the video, somebody broke into his car and stole all his stuff. Police haven't caught this woman or whoever it is that she is. So if you have any information, please contact the authorities. And also, if you want to help this driver out, hit the link in the description. That's where you can go to help him out. Thanks for watching. Number 6. The Screaming Barn. A delivery driver was doing his rounds on a rural route in Kentucky when he heard what sounded like a woman screaming in the distance. At first, he thought that it was just some kids being mean, but then he realized that it was coming from an old abandoned barn that stood eerily silent at the end of a long dirt road. As he got closer, he could hear the woman's muffled screams getting louder and more desperate. He stopped his truck and got out to investigate, but there was no sign of anyone in the area. The barn door was locked and bolted from the outside, so he couldn't check inside. But he could still hear the woman's voice echoing from within. It sounded like she was trapped inside the barn and begging for help. He ran around the building trying to find another way in, but it was no use. There were no windows or other openings that would allow him to get inside and help her. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed a small crack in the wood paneling near the top of the door. He put his eye to it and was shocked by what he saw. Inside the barn was a dark, dusty attic space with cobwebs hanging from the rafters. But that wasn't what caught his attention. It was the sound that was still coming from inside. The woman was still there, and it sounded like she was crying out in pain. He tried to call out to her, but his voice sounded weak and tinny compared to her screams. He knew he had to do something, but he didn't know what. Then he remembered his dash cam. He ran back to his truck and retrieved the audio recording from that day. And when he listened back, he could make out the woman's voice repeating the same phrase over and over again. "Help me, I'm still here." This chilling message was repeated 6 times before the recording ended. He rushed back to the barn and started pounding on the door, yelling for help. But there was no response except for the woman's screams. After a while, he stopped and took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't stay there forever, but he didn't want to give up. So he sat down on the ground next to the door and continued listening. He sat there for hours, and the only sound that broke the silence was the wind whistling through the cracks in the barn. As the sun began to set, he made the decision to go home and get some rest. He still had the audio recording of the woman's voice in his truck, and he hoped that someone else would be able to help her. He drove home, but he couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the barn. He tossed and turned in bed that night, and he could still hear her voice echoing in his ears. The next morning, he got up early and went back to the barn. He called the police and told them what he had found, but when they arrived, they couldn't hear anything. The barn was silent, and the only sound that could be heard was the crickets chirping in the grass. The police searched the area, but they didn't find any signs of life. They also checked the barn for any signs of a break-in or a missing person, but they didn't find anything. And so the case of the Screaming Barn remains unsolved to this day. Some people believe that the woman in the recording is still trapped inside the barn, and others believe that it was just a prank. But one thing is for sure, the driver will never forget the sound of that woman's voice and the feeling of helplessness that he experienced when he realized that he couldn't help her. Welcome back, everyone, to Unsolved Mysteries That Keep You Up at Night. Our next story comes from an anonymous user. I was driving from Nashville to Orlando with my best friend. We had just crossed into Alabama from Mississippi and were approaching the little town of Evergreen. The year before, we'd driven this route and had stopped in Evergreen for gas. I remember because the prices were so much lower than what we were paying back up north. And while getting our steps in, which is how we jokingly refer to filling up at the gas station, we noticed a guy who looked like he'd been camping out on the other side of the road, sitting there smoking a joint the size of a cigar and wearing what looked like nothing but a loincloth. Even for a guy who was living out of his car, he was far from clean and was covered in what looked like dirt and small pebbles. He must have been sitting there for hours because the joint had gone out and he was now lighting up another one without bothering to put the first one out. My friend and I just stared at each other, unsure if we should say anything or do anything. That's when the manager came outside and told us to get back in our cars and lock our doors. He said it was a long story and he didn't want to bother us with it, but that guy was not to be approached under any circumstances. He could be dangerous, he said. At the time, my friend and I thought he was joking around until he brought out a shotgun and chambered it. Then he said, "You guys see that guy? He was pointing down the road toward the same guy lighting up another joint. "He can be dangerous," the manager said again. "Don't approach him." Still not believing that any of this was real, my friend and I continued on our way. Now, a few months later, while driving through Evergreen, Alabama, the exact same thing happened. Only this time, the man wasn't sitting on the other side of the road, but he was instead standing right next to our car as we passed him. But something was very wrong. He was running. The man was literally running next to my car at 60 miles per hour. It was clear he'd been running alongside the road for quite some time because he was well hydrated and seemed to be enjoying himself. But what made the situation even more unnerving was his smile. Despite being drenched in sweat, he was still smiling. His teeth were completely white, almost like they'd been capped or whitened professionally. What made it impossible to look away, though, was his eyes. They were pitch black. They didn't have any whites in them. It was just black. No whites, no color, just black. My friend and I locked eyes with him for what felt like an eternity, but it was really only about a second or two. But that's all it took. As if someone had slammed on the brakes, he stopped running. And although he was still smiling, he suddenly raised his hand, palm out, and turned invisible. I don't mean that he walked off down a side road or behind a tree. He simply looked at us, smiled, raised his hand, then, poof, he was gone. We slowed down a bit and rolled past where he'd been standing, but there was no one there. In fact, we didn't see the man again. After what felt like the longest mile of my life, he reappeared. He was still smiling and still had his hand raised, except now he was standing on the other side of the road. But as soon as he opened his mouth to say something, a truck going the opposite direction sped past him and knocked him over. I honestly don't know what my friend and I would have done in a situation like this. If you encounter someone who appears to be homeless or worse, most people would probably just drive right by, maybe taking a moment to assess the situation and determine whether it's safe to stop and offer assistance. But I think we can all agree that if this person appeared to be dangerous, which this individual clearly did, you would absolutely drive right by without giving it a second thought. But this case seems to suggest that may not always be an option. Have you ever seen anything like this? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and come back soon for more unsolved mysteries that will keep you up at night. Welcome to my channel. Today's story is The Woman in the Fog. A man driving down a lonely stretch of road in California suddenly found himself in thick fog. As he struggled to see through the whiteout conditions, he slammed on his brakes for what he thought was a pedestrian, but it turned out to be nothing. Relieved, he looked back at the spot where he thought he'd seen something, but there was nothing or no one there. And so he continued on his way. He'd been driving for about 15 minutes when he saw what looked like a woman standing in the middle of the road directly in front of him. Startled by the sudden appearance of the woman, he slammed on the brakes, but he wasn't sure if he'd stopped in time. He looked out the window and saw that the woman was still standing there, her back to him. She was wearing all white, and her arms were stretched out like she was praying or something. Then, just as quickly as he'd seen her, she vanished. He blinked and looked away for just a moment, then looked back. And when he did, he saw that she had climbed onto the hood of his car. And when he started to scream and holler, she stood up on the hood and said, "Are you trying to kill me?" He put the car in park and asked her, "What are you doing?" To which she replied, "I want to go with you." He answered, "I don't know where I'm going," but she insisted that she wanted to go with him wherever that may be. So he figured, well, he could take her to the nearest gas station and let her get a ride from someone else. So he started the car and slowly began to drive forward, figuring she would jump off at any moment. But instead of jumping off, she jumped onto the windshield and started screaming at him, telling him to stop the car and get her out of this place. She said she'd run out of gas and had been stranded here for a long time. And he felt bad for her because it was obvious that she was cold and scared. And also, he knew that if she ran off into the fog, He might never see her again. And since they were already in the middle of nowhere, he figured it was better to have her in the car with him than out in the fog. So he pulled into a gas station and knocked on the door to get the attention of the attendant inside. When the attendant opened the door, he said, "Hey man, can you come out here real quick?" And the man came out and looked at the woman and said, "What's wrong with her?" To which the man replied, "I don't know. I found her on the side of the road, and I couldn't see very good because of the fog, and I thought she was a mannequin or something. So I stopped and asked her if she needed help, and she said she was freezing, and she wanted to come in out of the cold. I told her I'd take her to the nearest hospital, but she said she just needed to get to the next town over. So I'm taking her there now." And the attendant says, "Yeah, I see. Well, I think I know where she's headed. You see that road over there? Well, if you just take that road, it'll take you right into town. She should be fine." And the man thanked him and said, "Well, I appreciate your help," and got back in his car and drove off. As he drove, the woman in the passenger seat took off her coat, revealing that she was naked underneath. Then she reached over and started massaging his shoulders. And he says, "Whoa, hey, what are you doing?" And she says, "You're not going to believe this, but I'm a CIA agent and I've been tracking this guy for weeks now, and you just drove right into my trap." Then she pulled out a gun and shot him right in the neck. And as he slumped over in his seat, she said, "You know, you're the first person I've seen in weeks. I was getting pretty lonely." That concludes today's story. See you next time. The man driving the black car wasn't driving. He was slumped over the steering wheel, eyes closed, mouth open, snoring loudly. Gary slammed on the brakes, causing the man's head to slam into the steering wheel. "Wake up in there!" Gary yelled, pounding on the car's hood. The man in the car didn't stir. Gary tried the handle. It was locked. He looked through the window, but the driver was slumped over the wheel and didn't seem to notice anything. Gary thought maybe if he honked his horn, the driver would wake up and drive away. So he pressed the horn. It blared. The driver still didn't seem to hear it. Gary started to get worried. What should he do? Should he break the window? Should he call the police? He decided he needed to find out what was going on. So he walked around the car to the other side and climbed in through the passenger door. He was met by the smell of stale waste and a yellow sticky substance that stuck to his fingers. On the seat beside him, there was a half-empty bottle of water and a crumpled McDonald's bag. But there was no sign of the driver anywhere. Gary looked around for a way out, but all the doors were locked and the windows were rolled up. Suddenly, the engine turned on and the car lurched forward. Gary screamed, throwing his hands up in the air. He hadn't meant to sit down. Now he was trapped in a moving car with no driver and nowhere to escape. "Where are we going?" Gary shouted over the noise of the engine, but there was no reply. The car drove past familiar landmarks, turning left onto a busy street. Gary spotted a police officer ahead and prayed he'd be able to flag him down. As the car approached the officer, Gary pounded on the glass, but the officer couldn't hear him. He didn't even look over. Just as Gary's hope began to fade, the car screeched to a halt. The doors unlocked and the windows rolled down. Gary stumbled out, almost falling to the ground. The officer rushed over, helping him to his feet. "What happened?" the officer asked, noticing the distress on Gary's face. "I don't know," Gary stammered, "but I need your help." He explained about the car following him and how he'd gone to investigate and accidentally gotten into the car, and it had driven off with him in it. The officer listened patiently, then smiled. "That sounds like quite the story, but I'm afraid I don't believe you." Gary's heart sank. He knew the officer didn't believe him because he was black. In this small town, most people assumed that if a black person was driving a nice car, they must have stolen it. Gary could see the doubt on the officer's face and felt his anger rising. "Why don't you believe me? Because I'm black?" The officer stiffened and stepped back. "That's enough. You're not being cooperative, and I'm about to take you downtown." Gary knew he couldn't talk his way out of this, so he stayed silent, allowing the officer to handcuff him. As they drove in silence to the station house, Gary stewed over his bad fortune. Why did that stupid driver fall asleep? And why didn't anyone believe him? Maybe if he'd known the driver was sleeping, he wouldn't have climbed in the car. Maybe if he'd called the cops right away, they would have believed him. He sighed. It didn't matter now. All he could do was hope that whoever the driver was, they woke up soon, or at least that someone believed his story and set him free. At the station house, Gary told his story again, this time to an older, balding black man with a kind face. The man listened patiently, and when Gary finished, he said, "You want a lawyer?" Gary nodded dumbly. "Then let's go see my friend. He'll make sure you're all right." When they entered the office, Gary saw a TV on, tuned to a local news channel. The anchorman was talking about a black car that had been involved in several hit-and-runs. The car had no license plates, and the driver appeared to be asleep at the wheel. Gary stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open. That was the car. The driver was asleep. But who was driving the car? Gary had seen the driver's face when he first opened the door. He was slumped over the wheel, his face hidden behind a blue folder. Then when Gary climbed in, the driver had jerked awake and slammed his foot on the gas. He'd seen Gary and in a panic had turned away to hide his face, but Gary had already seen him. He knew who the driver was. It was Mr. Clayton, the owner of the car dealership where Gary worked. Mr. Clayton was a notorious cheapskate who drove his employees hard and never gave them a break. He was also a heavy sleeper. Gary remembered seeing him doze off at traffic lights before, but never for more than a few seconds. Now Gary understood. Mr. Clayton had fallen asleep at the wheel and the car had kept driving. He'd woken up and panicked, not knowing that Gary had seen him. He'd tried to get away, but Gary had recognized him and followed him to the station house. Gary suddenly felt very foolish. He should have known that Mr. Clayton was driving the car, and he should have realized that Mr. Clayton would never hurt him intentionally. Still, he was angry. Why hadn't Mr. Clayton woken up sooner? Or better yet, why did he drive while he was sleepy in the first place? Gary knew the answer. Mr. Clayton was always in a hurry. He was always trying to get somewhere else, always trying to make more money. Gary sighed. Maybe one day he'd learn his lesson. But until then, Gary was stuck working for him. Welcome to my channel. And today's scary story is The Face in the Rear View. A man driving across country decided to make a 12-hour drive into 2 days. About halfway into his trip, he stopped for the night at a motel. He parked his car and went to check in. While walking to the motel office, he glanced back at his car and saw a little girl sitting in the back seat of his car. Startled, he quickly looked away. He assumed that he had just imagined it, so he checked in and went to his room. Later that night, after he had gotten into bed, he heard what sounded like footsteps outside his window. He ignored it and tried to go back to sleep. Then he heard a knock on his window. He sat up in bed and saw the same little girl from earlier standing outside the window. She was trying to get his attention by knocking on the glass. He rolled down the window and asked her, "How did you get out there?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at him and smiled, then ran off. He called the police, but they said that it was probably just some kid playing a prank and that he should just forget about it and go back to sleep. He did as he was told and tried to go back to bed. But the next morning when he got up, he had an urge to look in his rearview mirror. To his horror, the little girl was sitting in the back seat of his car, smiling at him. He slammed on the brakes and whipped the car around. There was no one in the back seat. He checked everywhere. There was no one in his car. Still, the image of the girl stuck in his mind. He drove in silence for a while. Then he started talking out loud. He said, "Okay, this is getting creepy. There's no way a little girl managed to sneak into the car and then climb into the back seat without me noticing. There's no way." As if to prove him wrong, when he glanced at his rearview mirror, the little girl was back in the seat, smiling at him. This time, she mouthed the words, "I'm here." He screamed and floored it. He risked everything, speeding, weaving in and out of traffic. He just needed to get away from whatever or whoever was in his car. But the girl kept reappearing in the mirror. Every time he glanced at the seat, she was there smiling. Sometimes she would try to touch him, but her hand would just go right through his seat. Then she started speaking. Her voice sounded old and raspy, like she hadn't spoken in years. She said, "Let's play a game. I'll ask you questions, and if you answer correctly, I won't have to hurt you." He turned the radio up as loud as it would go, blocking out her voice with static. He figured that if he didn't respond, she'd eventually get bored and leave him alone. But she just kept talking. She asked him questions about cars, about his family, about his life, and every time he answered, she'd smile and nod, as if pleased with his responses. He drove like that until dawn. As the sun rose, he finally got a good look at the girl. Her skin was pale, almost white. Her eyes were a deep black, soulless. And her smile, it stretched ear to ear, revealing teeth that were far too sharp and long to belong to any human. Then she opened her mouth wide and stuck her tongue out. It was long and slimy like a snake's. And then she licked her lips, leaving a trail of saliva that dripped from her chin. He swerved into the emergency lane and hit the brakes. When he turned around in his seat, the girl was gone. The entire car was empty. But when he looked at the passenger seat, he saw a small porcelain doll sitting where the girl had been. And as he watched, it began to smile. He stumbled out of the car and threw the doll into the bushes. Then he got in the car and drove away, not stopping until he got home. And that's why, friends, you should never, ever hitchhike. If you want to hear more scary stories, stay tuned. Bye. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to look at a replay from the r malicious compliance subreddit. Our malicious complainer is a user, so this happened about 2 months ago in rural Nevada. I was driving home from a camping trip and stopped at one of these old rundown gas stations out in the middle of nowhere that seems to be open on a prayer and a half-inch of topsoil. They had just enough gas for me to get home and not much else. I pulled in and parked. An older guy in a cowboy hat was just finishing up sweeping the floor. "Morning," I said as I got out of my truck. "Morning," he said with a thick southern accent. "Just got in some fresh coffee. You want some?" "Sure," I said. "That sounds great." He poured the coffee for me and we stood there in silence for a moment while I drank it. It was actually really good coffee. "Thanks," I said. "Sure do smell that good this morning." "Smells like heaven," he said with a big smile. "Yep, that's what it does. Takes me back to when I was a young buck." I smiled back. "Well, enjoy the rest of your day, partner," I said, tipping my hat back to him. And I went out to my truck. When I returned an hour later after filling up, the station was completely boarded up. I looked through the window and saw that same guy sitting on a stool behind the counter sipping a cup of coffee and smiling at me. I couldn't help but smile back. That was my malicious compliance. My dad always used to say, "If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all." And the guy seemed pretty happy just talking about his day and reminiscing about the past, so I didn't feel bad about doing it. But if anyone here feels that this was wrong, let me know. I'm genuinely curious. So I am genuinely curious as well. When our MC said, "Enjoy the rest of your day, partner," was it said with a tipping of the hat? Because if it was, then that was definitely a malicious compliance. If it wasn't, then I agree with your assessment. This is more of a win for the boomer, so I want to hear from you. Leave a comment down below and let me know if this was a true malicious compliance or not. Also, I think this story has a lot of potential. I think there's a story here about a gas station that stays open on fumes and the people who keep coming in because they need just a little bit more gas to get to the next town. It's a dying industry. I mean, there are less and less gas stations that cater to the rural folks that need just a few more miles out of their vehicle. And I think there's a really interesting story here about how these gas stations struggle to stay afloat. So did the guy ruin the day of the old man by tipping his hat and saying, "Enjoy the rest of your day"? I think not. I think this is a case where maybe the boomer got a little bit of malicious compliance back because the guy came back and gave him something to do. You know, it kind of sucks being old and having nothing to do all day except sit behind the counter at a gas station in the middle of nowhere and drink coffee and wait for someone to talk to you. So maybe the boomer got a little bit of malicious compliance as well. I love stories like this because they remind me of the small town where I grew up. In fact, I used to drive a truck and I would go all over the state delivering furniture. And so sometimes I would end up in these tiny towns where there was one general store that sold gas. And I would stop in, and the locals would tell me all about their day. And it was really nice. There's something about the small towns that just bring out the kindness in people. This is probably why the Opie and Anthony show was such a big deal when I was growing up, because they traveled around the country looking for the best small towns to showcase how good people were. Anyway, what do you think? Was this malicious compliance? Let me know in the comments down below. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, because that tells the platform this video deserves more attention. Also, consider subscribing if you haven't already. This is one of the few creators who's not posting about politics or drama. We keep things lighthearted and fun, so I hope you can join the family. And with that said, have a great rest of your day. Stay safe out there. I'll see you on the next one. Hello, everybody. I'm here to share another scary story from truckers about things that go bump in the night. This one comes from a user named Not a Historian. The year was 2004. And I was a rookie trucker working my very first run solo from Indiana to California. I stopped at a truck stop for the night and parked my truck and went inside to use the restroom and grab some food. The parking lot was nearly empty. There was maybe one other truck there. As I'm finishing up in the restroom, I hear what sounds like someone turning on a car alarm. I think nothing of it and continue washing my hands. Then I start hearing what sounds like a woman screaming in the parking lot. I look out the window and see a car driving by with its bright lights on. I see the tail lights of the car and the bright brake lights. But when the car gets closer, I can see that there isn't anyone in it. The car is driving slowly and it stops right next to the other truck. I finish up in the restroom and leave the truck stop. As I get into my truck, I notice that the car is still there, and I can see a figure in the driver's seat. I think nothing of it and get into my truck. I put my foot on the brake and turn the key, and as the truck starts up, the radio cuts into static. I hit the button to switch the channel and the static clears. But what I hear makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It is a little girl's voice. She says very clearly, "Daddy, I found you." And then the line goes dead silent. My blood runs cold. It sounded exactly like my daughter. She had died 8 years prior in an automobile accident. How could this be? I jump out of the truck and run to the car. I look in the driver's seat and on the passenger side and see no one. I call out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" No response. I try the door handles. They are locked. I look in the windows and see nothing. I go back to my truck, get in and start it up, and the radio is filled with static again. I quickly switch the channel and the little girl's voice comes back on. She says, "Are you going to take me home now, Daddy?" I slam my foot on the brake and turn the engine off. What am I going to say? How do I respond to a dead radio? Of course I don't say anything. I just sit there stunned. Suddenly, the voice comes over the radio again. "It's okay, Daddy. I found you. I'm so happy." And then the line goes dead silent once more. My mind races. Is this really my daughter? Could she be alive after all these years? Or is this some sick prank? Who would do such a thing? Now remember, this is the pre-cell phone days, and so getting a hold of the company or anybody else is going to take a while. So I decide to drive. I got nowhere else to go, so why not head out on the open road? I get in the truck and start the engine, and the radio is filled with static once more. But before I can switch the channel, the little girl's voice comes over the radio one last time. "I love you, Daddy. Bye-bye." And then the voice fades away into static. To this day, I still wonder if it really was my daughter trying to tell me that she found me. I wish that I had a way to know for sure. That's one scary story from a trucker about things that go bump in the night. Hey, I just want to let you know that if you like this story, you can always check out more stories like this on my blog. And also, if you have a scary story you want to share, you can always submit it to my website. I might read your story on the podcast. Anyway, thanks so much for listening and have a great day. the car that followed itself. Two friends were driving down a deserted country road when suddenly they noticed a sleek black sedan tailing them. At first, it had been just another car on the road. They'd seen it briefly in their rearview mirror, but it had been driving normally and at a safe distance. But then it started to get closer and closer until it was right on their bumper. My friend and I exchanged glances. Neither of us said anything, but we both agreed to keep our eyes on the strange car in front of us. We were on a trip, so we decided to stop for some gas at the next station. It was an old, rusty gas station with only one working pump. But before we could even turn into the station, the black car overtook us and parked right behind us. I got out of my car and walked back to the pump. As I looked back, I saw the driver get out of the car and walk around to the trunk, and then he got back into the car and drove off. Now, this is where things start to get weird. After I got back into the car and we drove off, we saw the same car coming towards us on our side of the road. I slammed on the brakes and we skidded to a halt. The other car also stopped, but there wasn't anyone in it. There were no brake lights or turn signals on. We just stared at each other for a moment, wondering what was going on. Then the car turned around and drove back the way it came without even turning its headlights on. At this point, I was starting to get scared. I told my friend to drive faster. We didn't need to be tailgated by a phantom car. We sped up, slowing down only when a car came into view. We didn't want to cause an accident. Then about 20 minutes later, the same thing happened again. We were driving down a straight stretch of road when we saw the black car in our rearview mirror. We turned to see it overtake us and park right behind us. My friend and I started yelling and making tons of noise. We didn't know what else to do. Then the car turned its headlights on and started following us again. I was freaking out at this point. Why would a driver behave this way? Was he trying to scare us? What did he want from us? Finally, after what felt like hours, we arrived at a small town. We were both exhausted and just wanted to get home. So we booked a hotel room and went to bed. In the morning after, of course, locking the room door, we went down for breakfast. As we ate, we watched the morning news. One of the stories was about a stolen black sedan that had been spotted in the area the day before. The police were still looking for the car and its driver. The news anchor showed pictures of the car. It was the same car that had been following us. As soon as we finished breakfast, we called the police and told them about what had happened. They thanked us for the information and said that they'd look into it. Relieved that it wasn't just us, we went on about our day, expecting that someone would come to investigate the incident. But the strangest part of the story was yet to come. When my friend and I were getting ready to leave town, we went back to the hotel room. To get our bags, the same black car that had been following us was parked outside our door. My friend and I screamed and ran out of the hotel lobby and jumped into his car. We slammed the door and locked it. Then we started to drive away as fast as we could. This time, the car didn't follow us. And to this day, no one knows what that car was doing. Maybe it was a case of mistaken identity. Maybe the driver was trying to tell us something, or maybe, just maybe, it was all in our heads. We'll never know for sure. But one thing is certain. If I ever see a black sedan following me down a deserted country road, I'm not going to stick around to find out why. Welcome to my channel. Today's scary story is called The Voice in the Trunk. It was written by a user. The year before last, I was driving home from visiting my boyfriend, who lived 2 hours away. We had a fantastic day, and I was blasting my favorite music as I drove home on the empty country roads. I live in a very rural area, and these roads can get pretty creepy at night. It was around 11 p.m., and I was singing along to every word when suddenly I heard a knock, like someone knocking the body of a car. I rolled down my window to listen and to make sure I hadn't run over anything or anyone. I could hear the knock again, but this time it sounded like it was coming from my trunk. I quickly pulled over onto the side of the road, turned off my car, and listened intently. All I could hear was the crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. I decided to drive home to my parents' house. About 20 minutes later, it happened again. This time I was almost positive it was coming from the trunk of my car. I didn't pull over, but I did roll down both windows this time. I continued driving slowly until I reached the next gas station, which was about 5 minutes away. As soon as I got out of my car, I ran to the trunk and flung it open. There was nothing there. I swear that if I could have physically ripped the metal out of the trunk at that point, I would have. As my boyfriend and I were leaving, he noticed some old duct tape holding the handle shut. When we pulled into my driveway, I insisted on getting out and opening the trunk to prove to my dad that there was nothing there. Of course, my dad was no help and just kept telling me to get over it. It was probably just a branch or something. Well, we went inside and I told him to go check the trunk. He obliged and said, "See, nothing." And then he looked up with a confused expression. "Where's your radio?" I wasn't even listening at that point, and I just replied, "In the trunk." So he goes back outside, opens the trunk, and pulls out this old radio that must have been from the 80s and was covered in dust and cobwebs. It didn't have any batteries, so he put them in and then turned it on. My dad looked at me with wide eyes and asked, "What station is this?" I replied, "It's static. I think it's just a really old radio." And then he turned to me with the radio in his hand and said, "Sarah," and I replied, "Yeah," and he said it again. "Sarah, do you want to talk to someone?" And then he started laughing because he thought it was funny to play with me like that. And I laughed and said, "No, turn it off." And then he turned the radio back to static. And just as he did, I heard my name, clear as day. It said, "Sarah." We all three stood there staring at the radio for a few seconds, while the only sound in the room was the sound of static. Needless to say, we didn't have any reasonable explanation for what we had just heard. My dad took the radio back to his shed where he keeps all of his random crap, and I went inside to calm down a bit. I told my mom about it, and she just rolled her eyes and told me I was being ridiculous, but I could have sworn that I heard my name being said. I don't know. Maybe it was just some weird radio thing, or maybe it was a prank call or something. I don't know. But I haven't taken any chances. The radio has never been played since, and it's still sitting in my dad's shed collecting dust. Thank you for listening to this terrifying tale. If you liked it, please leave a like and a comment down below. Also subscribe so you don't miss another episode. And if you want to hear more stories like these, click here.